morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We really thank you for joining us. I'm Olivia. I'm the Membership Account Manager here at UKATA, and I'll be hosting today's session. It's really nice to see so many of you here and lots of different names from across the industry, so that's really delightful to see. Just before we get started with anything, I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping points. So, as you've already probably noticed, microphones and cameras will be switched off throughout the session. If you've got any questions, you should be able to see a kind of little Q&A section. That is where we'd like to push most of our questions and everything like that, if you do have any throughout the presentation. And following with that, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but the presentation will take up most of the allotted time today. But yeah, we will have time for questions at the end. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Tom White, who will be presenting today's webinar. So yeah, if everyone's happy, I will hand straight over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Olivia.
No problem.
Thank you to Kellyanne as well. It's really nice to be here, and thanks to everybody for coming. It's always good to talk about the book and how I came to write it, and I hope some of the stuff that I say today will be kind of interesting and spark some questions and discussion at the end. I'm just going to share my screen. So can everybody see that all right? Okay, great. So writing the history of the asbestos disaster and thinking about what happens next. It's been about a year since the book came out, about 11 months. I finished writing it in sort of February 2025. So it kind of feels like enough time has passed to kind of reflect on the book with a little bit of distance, and also to sort of take account of some of the things that have happened in the meantime. So that's what I'm going to try and do today, is kind of give an outline of the book and some of the things that I was thinking about whilst I was writing it, and then to kind of pick up some of the threads that I kind of left at the end of the book as well. So the question that I get asked a lot for people who aren't familiar with the world of asbestos when I tell them that I've wrote a book is, why asbestos? So in the mid-90s, my granddad, who you can see here on the left-hand side, was diagnosed with mesothelioma. He'd been a carpenter, and he'd worked with asbestos at some point in his working life. He was diagnosed in November of 1994 and then passed away in May of the following year. I mean, I was only very young at the time, but I sort of remember even then sort of thinking and kind of intuiting that something really sort of awful and tragic had happened to him. It was obviously only later that I sort of learned what asbestos was and what mesothelioma was. And my day job is in further education, so I work at Sheffield College, but I'm a writer on the side, and I write about rugby league and politics and art and various other things. But I always wanted to write something about asbestos and about what had happened to my granddad and our family. I never quite sort of got around to doing it. It never quite seemed the right moment. I never sort of quite knew how to begin. And then, as I'm sure lots of you will remember, in the sort of spring of 2022, there was the case with Cape Asbestos and Lee Day, who managed to secure the release of lots of documents from the Cape Asbestos archives, which basically kind of showed what a lot of people suspected all along, which was that Cape had known a lot sooner than they were letting on about the dangers of asbestos, and that they had downplayed those dangers. The release of those documents coincided with an exhibition by someone called Ilona Segar, which some of you may have seen or heard of. So this was a really amazing hour-long dual-channel film that was exhibited at the Serpentine Gallery in Hyde Park in the sort of spring of 2022, a film called The Body Blow. I've included a slide of it here. So it's this amazing installation where there's these two huge screens in this room, and both of them are playing these films, and it kind of tells the story of asbestos-related disease in Barking and Dagenham around the old Cape Asbestos factory. So this was the kind of moment where I thought, okay, like this is when I can write something about asbestos. So I wrote an article for the London Review of Books which came out that summer, where I kind of threaded my grandparents' story into sort of broader discussion of a loner's film and this document release. Um, it was off the back of that a couple of editors got in touch with me and sort of said, "Have you thought about writing a book on this material?" And at that point, I'd sort of thought about it a little bit, but that was when I sort of seriously started working on the book. And I guess the sort of question that immediately arises is, because asbestos is such a huge topic and there are all of these kind of technical and social and political aspects to it. The big question was, well, where do you begin? Fortunately for me and for all of us, I suppose, there is a kind of physical location where you can begin, and where I began, which was at Strathclyde University Library. As I'm sure many of you will know, thanks to the efforts of this kind of archivists there and academics at Strathclyde, Arthur McIver in particular, this library has lots of really amazing resources on the history of the asbestos disaster. So people like Nancy Tate, Alan Dalton, Laurie Flynn. I think Laurie Cousin-Allen's papers are there now as well. So this amazing sort of trove of documents and materials relating to the kind of the history of the asbestos industry, and also to the history of the anti-asbestos movement, which was really what I kind of wanted to focus on in my book. So I'd really recommend anybody who sort of wants to look into any of this in more detail to take a trip to Glasgow, because it's a really incredible resource. And I spent a lot of time there, and I feel like I only really sort of scratched the surface. It was whilst I was there doing these research trips in sort of 2023, 2024, that the kind of structure of the book began to emerge to me. And the book, I suppose it has a slightly odd structure in that the first half of the book is about the history of the asbestos industry, and the second half of the book is about the history of the anti-asbestos movement, and kind of brings the story up to the present day. The history of the industry, though, is incredibly complex and complicated, and it was quite a hard story, I realized, to tell chronologically. There would have been a lot of sort of jumping around from different places. So the way that I decided to structure it was as a focus on 3 different locations. And I kind of used each of those locations to tell a particular part of the asbestos industry's story. So the beginning, the first part of the book, is about asbestos mining in South Africa. So the book is about Britain. It's about the kind of the UK asbestos disaster. But the kind of thing that I sort of realized quite quickly, and that I hadn't really sort of thought about before I started this research, was that it's really impossible to tell the history of the kind of British asbestos disaster without also telling the story of South Africa and the history, particularly of sort of British imperialism in South Africa in the late 19th century, and then the history of apartheid after 1948 as well. So the story that I tell in that part of the book begins in the late 1800s. And I described the kind of birth of the asbestos industry in the south of Africa as a kind of a side project for a lot of the people involved with the diamond and gold mining concerns at that point. So there's already a kind of established gold mining and diamond mining industry. And then lots of the people who are in charge in those companies also get interested in asbestos mining. So asbestos, very abundant, very close to the Earth's surface, so relatively easy to mine. So for the first half of the 20th century, you have what's known as a tributor system. So people buying mining rights for particular areas of land, and then sort of basically outsourcing the mining operations to tributors. And then the unit of labor in that system is the family. So the men will be doing sort of rudimentary explosive work, mining the material, and then women and children are sorting it, and then they take it to the tributor and it's sold on. So that kind of industry, or that kind of form of mining, endures in South Africa really until the kind of 40s and 50s, when, because the asbestos industry is growing, demand for asbestos is growing, it kind of moves to something closer to what we would think of as kind of modern mining operations, so compounds where you have people stationed mining sort of deep shaft asbestos mines. So that type of mining is really dependent on apartheid for its profitability. So the British companies, Cape Asbestos, Turner and Newell, are all vertically integrated. So they own the land, they own the mines, they own the shipping networks, and then they own the factories back in Britain where this material is taken and manufactured into products. So this is a really kind of efficient, vertically integrated operation, very, very profitable, partly for that reason. Um, Part of the story that I tell is also about a union called the Black Allied Mining and Construction Workers Union, um, who in the 1980s went on strike at a mine in Penge in the Transvaal region, and basically decided that they were going to not work and call for the abolition of the asbestos industry. So I spend a bit of time in the first chapter of the book talking about this strike because I think it's a kind of really amazing moment in the history of the asbestos industry where you have men organizing in the most kind of unfavorable situation in sort of apartheid South Africa, who are calling for the industry to be banned at a point when sort of British trade unions are still sort of wrestling with that question. So that's something that I write about in the book and that I'd sort of encourage people to look into because it's a really interesting chapter in the story of asbestos mining. The next part of the book, I moved to the north of England to talk about asbestos manufacturing and look in particular at what was happening at the Cape factory at Hebden Bridge and various other places in the north. And this is also the chapter where I kind of go into thinking about the foundation of the NHS. And one of the things that didn't happen when the NHS was founded was an occupational health service. So one of the demands of particularly kind of groups like the Socialist Medical Association and some trade unions during the 1940s was when there were these initial discussions around the foundation of the NHS, they were also calling for the foundation of an occupational health service as well. And it was one of these things that kind of got lost along the way or kind of got lost to compromise. But I kind of speculate in the book whether or not an occupational health service would have helped end the kind of asbestos industry a bit sooner. This part of the book, I also talk about the Asbestosis Research Council and the Asbestos Information Committee. So I'm sure some people on this meeting will be familiar with these organisations. So these were trade bodies. So they were essentially founded by the big asbestos companies in Britain. But as their names suggest, they were meant to sound kind of academic and respectable. And the Asbestosis Research Council was based for a long time at Cambridge University and then the University of Edinburgh. And one of the things that I sort of go into in this part of the book is thinking about how these trade associations really sort of functioned to create doubt. So the kind of playbook that the asbestos industry was using at this time was something that they had taken up from the tobacco industry in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, the tobacco industry realized they have a huge problem. Tobacco causes lung cancer. They can't prove that tobacco is safe. So instead, what they do is they, with the help of a company called Hill and Knowlton, which was a big American PR company, they establish a tobacco research institute. And the intent there really is to produce doubt. So to kind of keep various questions of causation open. And it's very effective. And it's a kind of playbook that's taken up by the asbestos industry in the 1960s. And then later is taken up by the fossil fuel industry as well in the sort of 1980s. So one of the threads that I try and draw out in the book is thinking about how these trade bodies contribute to this broader narrative where science and scientific principles are kind of turned on their head in order to kind of ignore epidemiological facts and social facts and to kind of create doubt where there shouldn't really be any. So that's the second chapter, and then in the third chapter, we travel up to Glasgow. So, as I'm sure lots of people will be familiar, Glasgow has a very, very high incidence of asbestos-related disease, in large part because of the shipyards, but also as I go into in the book, lots of construction in Glasgow during the post-war period. So a real attempt to kind of move people out of dilapidated tenements and into sort of new housing. So I focus in particular on the Red Road flats, which are very sort of famous, infamous as well, I guess, block of flats in the north of Glasgow. These enormous tower blocks and slab blocks that were built in the 1960s. with lots of asbestos, so lots of asbestos internally, and then asbestos cement panels on the outside as well. And the kind of concerns about asbestos use on the shipyards, so kind of among men who were spraying asbestos insulation on the interiors of ships, that kind of spreads in the late 60s to construction sites, where you have lots of construction workers who are getting more and more concerned about their exposure to asbestos. So asbestos insulation panels that are being sawn and sort of drilled and sanded and installed in the Red Road flats. This becomes a really sort of important area of asbestos awareness. That image in the top left is from the journalist Laurie Flynn, who wrote a really amazing series of articles in the sort of 1973, 1974 about what was happening in Glasgow. So Laurie Flynn is a kind of interesting character in the asbestos story. So he was a journalist who did his apprenticeship with construction news. So he kind of became interested in asbestos then, and then he went on to write for Socialist Worker, and then he was employed by World in Action, this sort of TV documentary strand on ITV, and he made all of these really interesting films as well. But he wrote this series of articles basically about what was happening in Glasgow in the 70s, and the fact that there was men, particularly sort of men who worked on the shipyards and with asbestos insulation materials, who were just dying in huge numbers. And one of the threads that he also kind of drew out, which I talk about a lot in the book, is a kind of difficult relationship between individual trade union branches and then trade union leaderships. So in particular, Laurie Flynn focuses on a local branch of the Transport and General Workers Union in Glasgow. And that branch of the union was comprised of men who worked mainly on the shipyards with asbestos insulation materials, but also in other places as well. And that branch had a very, very high mortality rate, and they sort of had basically developed quite quickly a kind of anti-asbestos position. So they were calling sort of by the mid 1970s for the substitution of asbestos. But the broader trade union leadership, so the Transport and General Workers Union at the kind of national level in Scotland and the kind of UK level, were very, very reluctant to call for a ban on the material at that point. And the Scottish Trade Union Congress as well was reluctant to do so. So one of the things that I sort of try and talk about in the book is this this kind of difficult relationship between sort of quite active and very, very knowledgeable trade union branches, and then the sort of broader trade union movement, which takes much longer to really sort of get over this jobs versus health debate, which is a kind of perennial issue with a lot of occupational health issues. The basic position of the trade union leaders is, asbestos is dangerous, so therefore you should negotiate for more money for working with it. And the branch in Glasgow on the shipyards had realised that just wasn't a kind of a serious or sustainable position. One of the things that I begin to talk about in that chapter on Glasgow as well is the development of a kind of coherent anti-asbestos movement, and Glasgow and that branch of the Transport and General Workers Union play a really important role in that. So on the right hand side here, this is a collected version of Laurie Flynn's Socialist Worker articles, the really sort of striking cover design. On to the left of that, the man holding his hand out there, this is John Todd, who was one of the main figures in that branch of the TGWU. So very, very knowledgeable trade unionist. He'd worked with asbestos most of his life. His dad and his uncle had died from asbestos-related diseases. And he was a really sort of indefatigable campaigner on this issue, much to the annoyance of the national leadership of his union and to the STUC. He was sort of barred from various roles, and much to the annoyance as well of his employer Newell's. He was basically sort of blacklisted as well. To the left of him is, of course, Nancy Tate, founder of the Society for Prevention of Asbestosis and Industrial Diseases. In 1976, she wrote Asbestos Kills, which is the pamphlet you can see there on the left, and then she revised it the following year. I'm sure lots of people will be familiar with Nancy Tate, but just a kind of quick outline, I suppose. She became an anti-asbestos activist after her husband, William, passed away from mesothelioma in the late 60s. And she kind of went on this journey of self-education, and then sort of dedicated the rest of her life to opposing the use of asbestos and calling for a ban and substitution. One of the bits of the book that I really enjoyed writing was I kind of read a lot of the letters between Nancy Tate and John Todd from the late 70s when they were sort of trying to get together a kind of coherent anti-asbestos movement. And they sort of referred to themselves as a bit of a kind of odd couple, because John Todd was a sort of like socialist Catholic guy from the Gorbals in Glasgow, and then Nancy Tate was this kind of sort of middle class suburban former housewife from Enfield. So their letters are kind of quite affectionate, and they kind of joke about their sort of different backgrounds, but their kind of shared goal. So they're both kind of really important and kind of interesting characters in this story. So there's a nice Spade research poster there. The figure in the middle is Alan Dalton, who is another really important figure in all of this. He was a member of the British Society for the Social Responsibility in Science, which is a kind of radical science group that was founded in the late 60s. And he trained as an industrial chemist, but quickly became quite disillusioned with the kind of industry in the pharmaceutical industry where he worked for a while. So he dedicated the rest of his life to occupational health and trying to help people address issues like asbestos exposure. The pamphlet on the right is from a 1983 conference, which was held in Nottingham. And this is where I kind of end the first part of the book. And I basically kind of argue that just as this anti-asbestos movement is forming during the late 70s and into the early 80s, the kind of political terrain is shifting beneath their feet in various interesting ways. So you have a kind of steady decline in British manufacturing during the 1970s, which is then accelerated massively after 1979 with the election of Margaret Thatcher, and sort of deindustrialization really goes into kind of overdrive. So you have this kind of reduction in the use of asbestos because of concerns about its safety, but you also just have a kind of reduction in its use because there's less demand from British industry, because British industry is declining. Margaret Thatcher also kind of declares war on local government. And one of the bigger arguments I make in the book is that to have a kind of effective asbestos removal and remediation program, you kind of need kind of ambitious and well-resourced local government. But it's kind of precisely at this moment that idea is being undermined by Thatcher's kind of neoliberal restructuring of the British state. This conference, though, in 1983, I think is really interesting. I think in some ways this is like a kind of high watermark for anti-asbestos organising. So I've just included here, one of the pages is a kind of example of leaflets that people were kind of circulating. So there's lots of tenants groups on council estates who were really concerned about this issue, who are getting quite well organised. And then on the right hand side there, this is sort of from the list of groups that were attending. So you can see there are kind of there are tenants and residents associations, there are kind of action groups, there are trade unions and trade union councils, there are various other tenants federations there, North Lambeth Law Centre. So you have this really kind of interesting mix of different kinds of occupational and kind of residential and kind of environmental knowledge of asbestos. I'll just read a little bit from the book at this point, actually, because I think it sort of conveys this section quite well. The situation was particularly bad in Glasgow, but across the UK there was a growing awareness of the dangers of asbestos and mounting concern and anger about the apparent complacency and disregard shown by the authorities. In November 1983, members of more than 60 groups met at the Queen's Walk Community Centre in Nottingham for the first National Tenants and Trades Union Asbestos Conference. Several union branches and a handful of regional trades union councils were there, but most of those attending were from housing charities and co-ops, tenants' rights groups and anti-asbestos campaign groups. These range from the relatively well-established Spade, Hull Action on Safety and Health, Shelter National Housing Aid Trust and Kensington Law Centre, to local tenants groups, many of which had mobilised after the broadcast of Alice, A Fight for Life, the previous year. Marie Patheras, another important figure in the anti-asbestos movement, opened the conference with an account of the campaign she had led on the Loughborough estate in South London, after residents had discovered that their flats contained large amounts of crocodylite. After a presentation from Alan Dalton on safe asbestos removal, the rest of the day comprised workshops on making effective demands and the tactics to achieve them, the roles of tenants groups and trade unions, and the relationship between local and national action. There were many successes to share, as well as significant challenges and difficulties. Several groups spoke of the lack of consultation from councils around removal plans, which were often carried out in a haphazard and dangerous manner. In the final session, participants discussed the general demands that would underpin a national anti-asbestos campaign and agreed on three: an admission from the government that all asbestos is deadly, a ban on its import, manufacture and use, and government funding to enable local authorities to remove as much as possible. By the time of the Nottingham Conference, it was clear that the British asbestos industry was already in terminal decline. From a peak in the early 1970s, demand for asbestos products had fallen sharply towards the end of the decade. This was due in part to growing safety concerns and the availability of substitute materials, but was mostly driven by broader trends in the British economy. By the early 1980s, the industrial markets for asbestos were a fraction of their former size, a situation starkly illustrated by the growing number of empty shipyards on the Clyde. In the wake of the broadcast of Alice, A Fight for Life, Turner and Newell's share price plummeted and the company posted a record annual loss of nearly £30 million. But the firm had already been deep in the red by 1980. In short, as Geoffrey Tweedale later wrote, the magic of asbestos was fading. This was far from the end of the matter, though, and an outright ban on the material was still a distant prospect. In the context of deindustrialisation, rising unemployment, and the Tory assault on the collective power of unions, many of the remaining asbestos workers were critical of the anti-asbestos movement and what, from their perspective, was the unnecessary panic it was generating. In an article for New Society in September 1983 titled "Fighting Each Other Over Asbestos," Helen Chappell narrated a conflict that was only becoming more rancorous as the industry shrank: jobs versus health. For many workers, a ban on asbestos was inextricable from the increasingly grim economic situation and their limited prospects if they were made redundant. Noting the rapid decline of the British asbestos cement industry over the previous decade, one trade unionist told Chappell that while, quote, "the anti-asbestos lobby says thousands of people will die from asbestos-related diseases before the end of the century, all I see is jobs walking out the gate." On the health side of the debate, Chappell spoke to Jimmy Burns, a former Clyde shipyard lagger who began working in the industry in the late 1940s. Burns recounted how he had been sacked from multiple jobs and then blacklisted for insisting on even the most basic safety measures. He criticised the new regulations that had been introduced earlier that year, which required firms to obtain a licence from the Health and Safety Executive to work with asbestos. The 1983 asbestos licensing regulations stipulated that any contractor handling asbestos-based insulation and coating must receive training and be registered with the HSE. Licenses were easy to acquire, and the fines for breaking the rules were generally small. Criminal prosecutions were possible, but vanishingly rare. As had been the case with the factory regulations, fines were really just a small tax on potentially deadly conduct. Moreover, at the same moment it was being tasked with sizable new responsibility, the HSE faced several rounds of cuts. It had always been a flawed organisation, but between 1980 and 1988 it was further undermined. The number of inspectors was cut by 23%, and its employment medical advisory services by 42%. Jimmy Burns recounted seeing two young, inexperienced contractors stripping asbestos insulation panels from a school in a cloud of dust. "Everybody's playing at it, i.e. regulation," he told Chappell, talking about ironing boards when schools and hospitals and shopping centres are riddled with it. "What good are regulations anyway when anyone can set up a stripping business for a few quid?" he asked. In Burns's view, asbestos removal shouldn't be seen as a profit-making enterprise, but as an environmental health issue. Underpinning both Burns's comments and the discussions at the Nottingham Conference was a general understanding that tackling the asbestos disaster required strict environmental and occupational health regulations, well-trained and unionised removal workers employed by properly resourced local authorities, all underwritten by a commitment towards public health, decent social housing, and the very idea of the public realm. In other words, precisely the things that Thatcher and her Tory government, just beginning their second term in office, were committed to undermining and dismantling. It would be in this context that the anti-asbestos campaign groups continued the tasks of lobbying for an outright ban and supporting the growing number of victims and their families. As for the material itself, it mostly stayed where it was. So that's the way I kind of end the first half of the book. And in the second half, I move away from sort of thinking about these particular locations and begin to sort of think chronologically about the history of anti-asbestos groups since the early 1980s and the kind of challenges that remain. I talk a little bit about Richard Jackson, who some of you may be familiar with, who founded the Hull Asbestos Action Group. Very effective group in Hull, supporting people with asbestos-related disease, and then also lobbying for a ban on the material. I talk about him though because his kind of struggles really indicate how hard it was to kind of maintain attention to asbestos during this period. So by the early 90s, the demand for the group's work was growing. So there was lots of demand from people who had asbestos related disease. Richard Jackson was monitoring asbestos removal in Hull and making sure it was being done properly. But he was basically sort of doing this all himself. And by this point, he was in his mid 70s. Shortly after he wrote the 1992 report, which you can see on the left hand side, he himself was diagnosed with mesothelioma. So he had worked on shipyards in Hull, repairing ships, working with asbestos, and he passed away in 1994 from mesothelioma, and the group basically disappeared. So I sort of, in this period, I'm sort of trying to think about how these groups sustain themselves, how they continue lobbying for these kind of medium and longer term goals, including a ban on asbestos, and how they're trying to kind of support support people who are struggling, which becomes their kind of main kind of short to medium term goal. I write a little bit as well about the introduction of the asbestos ban in 1999, which I kind of describe as a kind of a victory for these groups, but also something of a tragedy as well. So New Labour comes to power in 1997, sort of promising an asbestos ban, and it kind of actually takes them a little while to get this done for various sort of political reasons that I go into in the book. But the basic argument I make is that New Labour seem to think that once you've banned something, you can kind of draw a line under it, and that's the end of it, and that this will sort of disappear. And we all know that that's not the case, and that there was never an attempt really to kind of come up with a coherent long-term plan for removing asbestos, particularly as all of those kind of post-war schools and hospitals and social housing kind of reached the end of its design life. There was no real plan about what was going to happen. I think particularly with the kind of ramifying effect of austerity after 2010, we're really sort of now living with the consequences of that failure. To jump forward a little bit, this was a kind of interesting document that I wrote about from 2015. So this was the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Occupational Safety and Health. This work was kind of led by MP Ian Lavery. So this is, from over a decade ago now, but why Britain needs an asbestos eradication law. This was 2015. I think it's kind of interesting and kind of depressing as well to read the timetable that they kind of set out here. So the second half of this quote I have here, all asbestos which ensures that removal is completed as soon as is reasonably practical, but certainly no later than 2035. In the case of public buildings and educational establishments such as schools, this should be done by 2028, so 2 years from now. One of the other sort of recent documents that I write about, something that wasn't really noticed at the time, but which I remember seeing and being interested in. This is from Labour's manifesto in 2017, so under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. We will introduce a fairer funding formula that leaves no school worse off while redressing the historical underfunding of certain schools. Labour will also invest in new school buildings, including the phased removal of asbestos from existing schools. It's an interesting one because I think it's it's the only occasion I could find where you have a kind of party manifesto in an election actually mentioning the dreaded word asbestos. So something that we can sort of talk about a little bit more, I guess, is that I think now asbestos has become this kind of political and social Pandora's box that nobody is willing to open. And it was kind of interesting at this moment that you had a kind of explicit mention of asbestos and beginning an asbestos removal program in schools. Something I talk about towards the end of the book is the select committee from 2021, 2022, which kind of revisited this question of asbestos removal and came up with a series of kind of relatively sensible recommendations, including a 40-year deadline for asbestos to remove from public and commercial buildings, a recommendation that was kind of dismissed out of hand at the time by Rishi Sunak's government. That kind of brings us, I guess, to close to the present moment. So one thing that happened as I was kind of writing the book was a kind of a general election was kind of looming, and then before I'd finished writing the book, it arrived, and I think there was quite a lot of hope among anti-asbestos campaigners that the election of Labour in 2024 might see some sort of change or might see some significant movement on the idea of a asbestos eradication plan. I was a little bit skeptical of that, and I say in the book I wasn't so hopeful on the basis that kind of Labour were coming into power with all of these kind of ridiculous self-imposed fiscal rules, which kind of seemed to me that they kind of precluded the kind of large-scale public investment that would be needed for this sort of plan. So that's where I kind of leave it in the book. As I was saying at the start, it's been interesting over the last year to kind of watch as some of these discussions develop. One of the most interesting recent developments, I think, is something that a lot of people might be familiar with. So the work of Professor Daniel Murphy at Glasgow University and the work of Charles Pickles as well for airtight and asbestos. And I think a kind of growing, if not consensus, and a sort of growing acceptance that the statistics that we have for kind of annual deaths from asbestos are kind of huge underestimates. So Daniel Murphy's work in particular on asbestos-related lung cancer would seem to suggest that the kind of ratio of deaths between mesothelioma and asbestos-related lung cancer isn't 1-to-1, which is what the HSE uses to come up with their annual estimate, but is maybe more like sort of 1-to-6 or even as high as 1-to-9. So rather than 5,000 annual deaths, we're sort of looking at something closer to like 20,000, 25,000. Richard Blunt, who was another really sort of inspiring anti-asbestos campaigner, has done a lot of work. I attended a talk he did with Professor Murphy actually a few weeks ago, and his point is quite simple. He says we should just stop using this 5,000 deaths figure. It's not accurate. It's a massive underestimate, and I tend to agree with that. So that, yeah, just a mention of, I'll put all of these sources in the PowerPoint as well to circulate at the end. And then just a kind of selection of more recent asbestos stories and the extent to which, one of the things I sort of try and talk about in the book is how attention to asbestos kind of ebbs and flows. Like asbestos related diseases, because they have such long latency periods, can be quite difficult to kind of convey in the sort of usual sort of quick cycle of the kind of news. But I think there is something happening at the moment where these stories are coming more and more. And I think in combination with Professor Murphy's work, I think there maybe is a sort of tipping point coming soon where this kind of re-emerges into the public consciousness in a really serious way. So just a kind of selection here. The kind of play sand one, I think, is one that people might have seen in particular, sort of really egregious story. And also kind of looping back as well, I guess, to the idea of a kind of coordinated plan. And the thing I sort of try and say to people is, this isn't, in Britain in particular, where there were very high levels of asbestos use, this would obviously be a massive technical and logistical challenge, but it's not primarily a technical and logistical challenge. It is primarily a challenge of the political will. And this is not sort of pie in the sky stuff. There are places where this is happening. So these two stories were from the same week in March when I was preparing another talk. So Edinburgh schools, lots of asbestos found in Edinburgh schools and nurseries, and the same week an education district in South Korea announces job done, a decade spent removing asbestos from their school estate, and they've done it. So one of the models that I talk about in the book and that people talk about is the Asbestos and Silica Safety and Eradication Agency in Australia, which I think in some ways is a really kind of interesting model. I think would be difficult to translate to Britain because Australia has a federal government. Britain, we have a much more centralised state. And one of the things I sort of mentioned earlier, I guess, is this idea of kind of asbestos as a Pandora's box. So the Department for Education, they know that there's a huge asbestos problem, but they're kind of not really willing to say the words because it opens this this kind of worms. And I think that's kind of where we're at the moment. I think we're kind of near this tipping point where either a devolved government or a particular department is going to have to face this and kind of look this issue in the eye. And I hope that happens soon. Maybe I'll end there.
Hello, thank you, Tom. That was brilliant. Really appreciate you joining us today and delivering such an insightful presentation. We really do appreciate it. So we will move on to our Q&A session. So if anyone does have any questions, if you'd like to fire them across into the Q&A section on your Teams, there should be an option there for you to chuck any questions in there. I'll give you all a few seconds to have a think about anything. I know that Kelly has put the link in the Teams chat so that you can purchase Tom's book. If that is something you would like to do, I'd definitely recommend going, having a little click through there and having a look at that if you get a chance. And yeah, like I said, I'll just give you all a few seconds. If you have got any questions, please feel free to just fire them across. While we wait, Tom, will we be seeing you anywhere anytime soon? Will you be attending any? Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Derek.
Thanks, Derek.
Will you be attending any expos? Have you got any events or anything coming up or anything along those lines, really?
Nothing set at the minute, but I'd like to go to some of the conferences this autumn. So I know that there are a few big conferences happening, one in Birmingham. I'm working at the minute on another article, sort of picking up this discussion of asbestos related lung cancer deaths. So I was just speaking to an editor over the last week about that. So I'm working on that as well. So sort of trying to bring some of these kind of elements of the book up to date.
Yeah.
It's funny kind of writing a book because obviously as soon as you press send, it's kind of out of date, you know. I think I kind of sent it off in February 2025, and then the following week the HSE sort of made a couple of announcements about asbestos, and you sort of think, oh man, couldn't they have done it last couldn't they have done it last week? So it's good to sort of come back to it and kind of update some of these discussions. So.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. So we have had a couple of questions, I believe. So the first one we've got from Michael. So Michael's put, hi, Tom. Difficult question to answer as it's early days, but do you envisage the Burnham government will take a more proactive approach re asbestos removal from public buildings?
Hi, Michael. Well, I hope so. I hope so. It is early days. Burnham, I think, is trying to walk a little bit of a political tightrope. So he's trying to kind of, I think he's trying to bring people on the left back into the fold after Keir Starmer. He's also trying to kind of keep impressing the Daily Mail by talking about cracking down on benefits claimants. So I'm not entirely sure what his kind of political project is. I think there's maybe more hope now. I guess it's tricky. Kind of as I mentioned in the talk, I think a lot of anti-asbestos campaigners were very kind of excited to see Stephen Timms come into his ministerial role. So Stephen Timms is MP minister. He oversees the department that manages the HSE. I think when he came into office, there was a lot of hope because he's very knowledgeable about asbestos. There isn't another MP who, maybe Ian Lavery, but Stephen Timms is one of the most knowledgeable, lots of interactions with the anti-asbestos movement. But I kind of get the feeling that his hands are tied by sort of broader political decisions. I think the argument I try and make in the book, and I think the way to think about this and the way that somebody like Andy Burnham should be framing this, right, is like, this is a massive technical and logistical challenge, but it's also a kind of political opportunity, right? So if you say we're going to remove asbestos from all of these schools, then that's also a kind of moment where you can say, well, like we're going to look at the broader education system. We're going to look at, the relationship between schools and colleges and universities. You kind of have to fold it into this bigger progressive project. Like, don't kind of just see it as like a standalone sort of logistical issue. Try and reframe it as a kind of, refounding of the kind of education system, a kind of rebuilding in the kind of literal and kind of metaphorical sense. So that would be my. I'm not sure Andy's listening, but that would be my sort of sense of it. But yeah, it's a good question. We'll see. I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Tom. So Kerry has said, has the switch from local authority owned social housing to housing associations had any effect on asbestos management / removal?
I think it has. Yeah, that's a really good question. Housing associations seem like a real mixed bag. I think like there's a lot of them that are quite good. A lot of them I've read lots of horror stories. I do write in the book, I think in the 5th chapter, about, I think it's Magenta it's called, which is a housing association in Liverpool, where their team of maintenance engineers had a quite long running dispute basically around sort of asbestos safety in flats when they were doing sort of remedial work. And if I remember correctly, I think this housing association had basically sort of said to them, like, like you can wear loads of PPE if you think there's asbestos, but if the tenants ask you why you're wearing it, just kind of try and, obfuscate, like don't say the A word. And they obviously sort of objected to this. So I think it is a real mixed bag. And I think one of the things that was happening but was cut off at the knees in the sort of late 70s, early 80s was that you had kind of council-led asbestos removal departments. So I know that Southwark Council had a big one, and other sort of large councils as well. But yeah, I think it is a mixed bag. It's a really good question, actually. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So Joanna has said, do you think that a general decline in unionised workforces in the UK have contributed to a lack of pressure in this area?
Yeah, I think that's probably probably accurate. It is definitely one of the sort of bigger kind of political and theoretical sort of threads in the book, where I sort of try and talk about the relationship, as I was saying, with the situation in Glasgow between sort of individual trade union branches and the sort of broader trade union leaderships. I think, yeah, after the sort of 1980s, and particularly with the sort of pressure of deindustrialization, where you get from some unions, you do get a real resistance to a ban on asbestos, because as they see it, and in some ways this is a kind of legitimate position, they see it that their job as a union is to protect the employment of their members. And if their members are people who are working in asbestos cement factories, well, then that's what they do. You then, as I was sort of talking about there, you get a kind of split between trade unions of men who are working with asbestos on places like shipyards, who quite early are sort of fighting for a ban on the material. But I think that sort of general decline from the sort of mid 1980s, I think probably does contribute. And I think one of the things I try and write about is, I guess in the wake of COVID, there was a bit of a kind of, I think a lot of trade unions got a lot more members, but particularly in the sort of education sector. Obviously, there's lots of stuff happening with schools during COVID and sort of pressure on teachers to go back into work when they felt it wasn't safe. As I kind of see it, I think that education trade unions and the NEU in particular is going to be sort of vital to any sort of coherent asbestos eradication movement. I think that's where this pressure is going to come from sort of coalitions of trade unionists in education in particular, and hospitals and healthcare, and then sort of parents and service users of various kinds. That seems to me like the most likely source of pressure, and I think it will come from that, rather than kind of, to go back to Michael's earlier question, rather than being something that's kind of suddenly introduced from on high. I think the pressure will come from below.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Tom. I believe we may have a couple of questions in the kind of messaging chat. So Yvonne has put, what do you think is the future of asbestos in the widest possible meaning?
Well, thanks, Yvonne. Nice, nice question. Well, I guess there are several aspects of that. I mean, one thing that people do ask about is, and it's a very good and legitimate question, is, well, what happens to asbestos once it's been removed? So it's one thing to sort of call for this like large scale asbestos removal plan, but then where does that asbestos go? I think is obviously a very interesting question. And historically it has been buried, put into landfill, which is really just kind of creating a problem for people in 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, whenever. Um, One thing that I sort of mentioned in the book and that I think is a kind of interesting area is research and sort of attempts to remediate asbestos into kind of useful material. So I know that there are a couple of companies in Britain, a couple in France. It's kind of relatively small scale at this point, very sort of energy intensive. So there's certain challenges there, but basically sort of transforming asbestos into a kind of inert material that can be then used, particularly as sort of road building or sort of groundworking material. So in a sort of practical sense, that's kind of one answer to the future of asbestos. Um, in terms of thinking about asbestos, maybe sort of more broadly, I think, the idea of a sort of global ban is obviously something that is an important element of this. So I kind of, in the conclusion, I sort of try and broaden the scope a little bit to talk about the kind of global picture. And it does really surprise people sometimes when you tell them that there just isn't a global ban on asbestos. There are lots of countries where it's still legal and it's being used. Lots of places where it's being exported to. So I think that I think is a perennial source of frustration though for anti-asbestos campaigners. So the kind of, without going into too much sort of technical detail, but the kind of the body that is responsible for a kind of global ban potentially being introduced is really not fit for purpose, and it's very easy for asbestos producing countries to kind of block any sort of meaningful progress towards a global ban. So kind of thinking about that is obviously an important element of this as well, because like I spoke to the trade unionist who was involved in the foundation of the Australian Asbestos Agency, and he made the really good and sort of interesting point that, like, you can have a national ban, but if asbestos isn't banned globally, asbestos will, get into your country. And we've seen this. It's arrived back in Britain in components that haven't been checked, or in various other places. So until there's a global ban, there isn't you're not going to have 100% successful national ban until you have a global ban. So that's another important element, I think, as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Tom. Alison has said, I worked in a local council and independently ran academies that really didn't want to address the issue. The asbestos issues in their school. Do you think there needs to be some reform with regard to what those schools spend their money on, or the government making a central pot available for those kind of works and making sure that schools are safe?
Yeah, this is a really good question, Alison. It's something that I was sort of writing something about. I'd like to do a sort of big article about asbestos in schools and kind of focusing on this in particular, because this is a really sort of important and quite troubling element. So maybe for people who aren't familiar, but the English school system over the last sort of 20 years has basically kind of privatized part of its provision into something called academies, which are run by trusts. They're meant to be sort of non-profit, but in reality, they're not really. So lots of schools that used to be managed by local government have passed into the hands of these academy trusts, and there is a real concern that a lot of these trusts either don't have the expertise in sort of asbestos management, or the interest in actually doing it. So, like, a lot of these academy trusts have inherited buildings with quite bad asbestos issues, and I think there's a lot of concern that they're not really addressing it properly. In terms of the question, yeah, I mean, I think there does need to be sort of stricter enforcement of this. I mean, personally, I'd like to see academies completely, abolished outright. But that's maybe a different discussion. But yeah, this is one of the interesting things about this, because my kind of perspective on this is that schools are the kind of most obvious place where you can sort of, I think, develop a really sort of good anti-asbestos campaign. But in England, we also have this situation where, like, a lot of schools have now been removed from local government control into academies, which then makes that task kind of more difficult again. So yeah, it is a really important area, and I think the Department for Education, I think, doesn't really want to address this. Like they came out earlier this year with a 10-year estates strategy. So this kind of 80 or 90-page document about schools that are in states of disrepair, that need repair and need rebuilding. And I did the sort of Control F on the PDF and search for asbestos, and it wasn't mentioned anywhere. So I think, yeah, there's a real sort of reluctance from the DFE more broadly to actually sort of look this issue in the eye.
Brilliant, thank you, Tom. So we've got just around 5 minutes left. So we'll go through the last few questions. So Vincent has asked, with asbestos removal costing so much, a question should be raised of where this money will come from, as all organisations are short of cash flow with the economic condition at present.
Yeah, it's a good question. It would be very expensive. Yes, I mean, it's one of the things that I sort of talk about a lot with this is it would cost a lot of money to remove asbestos from the public realm and from the built environment. I think it would be money well spent, and I think if we can find billions and trillions of pounds for nuclear submarines and sort of weapons contracts and various other things, that we can find the money for this. I don't deny that it would be a sort of difficult political choice, but the government makes political choices all the time, and I think this should be a priority. As I sort of said earlier as well, there's a way that you can kind of fold this into a bigger political kind of renewal project after austerity. So you can say, we're going to remove the asbestos from this school. We're also going to, make sure it's insulated so that students can learn in appropriate conditions during heat waves, which are going to be more frequent. We're going to put solar panels on the roof and heat pumps. You're not just kind of arguing for this as a kind of one-off kind of issue. You're saying this is something that necessitates like a broader approach to the public realm. And I think that would be the way that I would definitely sort of try and think about it. But there's money for this. There's money for if there's money for increased defense spending, there's money for this. It's a political choice. And as well, one of the things that I sort of researched during the book was even if you wanted to do a sort of cost benefit analysis of this, so even if you wanted to frame it kind of economistically in terms of if we do this, what will the saving be for the NHS in terms of not having to treat people with asbestos related disease? I think in a sort of long-term scenario, this would end up being a kind of a good investment. So even if you don't want to make the case sort of morally and politically, even if you wanted to just make it kind of economically, it would make sense to do this, I think. Oh, you're muted.
So sorry, it's because I had to do a little sneeze in that last one. So I'll not make you all listen to that. So we'll go with one last question. So William has asked, is the failure to identify asbestos on site and therefore the training of people a major issue that contributes to the danger?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, like anecdotally, and then also from the research I've done, it's not treated seriously. And if this also is a kind of issue that flows upwards. So if you don't have regulations that are enforced strongly, that doesn't filter down to then the sort of everyday practice. So I'm like with lots of things, I'm sure it's a kind of mixed bag. I'm sure that there are lots of places where this is taken very seriously, is addressed appropriately. I'm sure there are lots of instances where it isn't. And I think that's partly what kind of drives me to sort of say that this is something that needs to be sort of decommodified. So once you remove it from the sort of market mechanism, you remove the incentive to do it on the cheap, which is kind of when we see the most dangerous kind of practices. But I think this sense that kind of a lot of asbestos management plans for buildings it's a kind of box ticking exercise, and then it sort of goes in the drawer, and it's not actually sort of a kind of live document that people refer to. I think is a massive issue. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. So we'll round up today's webinar, and I just want to say a big, big thank you to everyone for joining us, and an even bigger thank you for Tom for sharing your knowledge and your expertise. We really appreciate that, and I'm sure everyone that's joined today and everyone that will be listening in the future really appreciates that too. We hope you all found this session informative and valuable, and we will be uploading this webinar to our website in the future, so that it can be accessed and viewed from there. I believe it will also go ahead onto our YouTube account, so can be watched forevermore. So thank you everyone for attending, and we really hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope that you all had a lovely hour or so. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you all at our future webinars.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you.